We got actually got a question from one of our web viewers, Michael, and I think it's kind of a long question, so I'm going to try to summarize it, and I apologize to Michael if I get it wrong. But the question has to do with authority, and I think Alan showed a slide where PHMSA says they don't have the authority to address climate change under their existing authority. And Michael, I think if I'm reading this right, says, well, you have the authority to protect the environment. Isn't this one and the same? So the question was, and I think it's to either Mark or maybe Dan, whether the other panelists agree that PHMSA has no authority, and if everybody does agree to that, when PHMSA is planning to seek such authority.
So let me take a run at that, and then excuse me, others can chime in. I think the answer is that this is a complex picture, and we've got a system that across the value chain goes from the wellhead, the well site where the drilling takes place, to the gathering lines, to the transmission lines. Mark put up a slide that was a schematic of the system from the big pipes to the smaller distribution pipes. Across that, you overlay, let's say, on the upstream side of that, you've got the Bureau of Land Management, the federal government, which regulates activities on federal lands. You have EPA, which has authorities more broadly, kind of potentially across that system. In the interstate area, you've got both PHMSA and FERC, which is an independent federal agency. And then, of course, you have state regulators that are involved across that matrix. So I think what we are in the process of trying to sort out collectively, and certainly from the administration perspective, is what's the right mix of tools to get at these issues across that whole value chain. And so I think that's going to turn out to be a combination of authorities, a combination of tools, and a combination of actions from across those actors.
So first of all, I commend the administration for looking at this in a comprehensive way, and we agree that you do need to look at the variety of responsibilities and tools that are available. And a simple answer to the question is yes, right? PHMSA has the ability to set standards for public safety, property, or the environment. And so the issue of climate change is an environmental issue. Now, that's not to suggest, right, that environmental standards or environmental concerns should trump a focus on public safety. I think we can all agree that preventing catastrophic failure of infrastructure is in everyone's interest and should be job one. But I think what we're also seeing from the work that we're doing is that there is plenty left to do once we have addressed the critical safety issues. There are many states where Class 1 and Class 2 leaks are being attended to expeditiously, and yet there are inventories of Class 3 leaks that go unaddressed. That's on the distribution side. We have a situation in the United States where we don't even have a national inventory of gathering infrastructure. So we don't, as a practical matter, even know where some of our gathering infrastructure is, and this is becoming all the more important as we rely on this gathering infrastructure as we increase production of oil and gas in rural and suburban communities. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. And environment is very much part of PHMSA's mandate.
Let me just see if Christina, since we're talking about something you said, Alan, let me just see if Christina has anything to say first.
No, I'm going to yield to Alan.
Okay, fair enough. Go ahead, Alan.
No, I was just going to say, I think we're doing what we can do, and as Dan mentioned, I think the authorities are being worked out. Our authority is really pretty narrow, as defined in our enabling statute. Certainly it covers environmental responsibility. It's really been related to Clean Water Act type issues, releases from oil pipelines and the like. But I would say we're doing what we can do. As I mentioned, our regulations do affect and ultimately benefit. With the executive order, we are addressing the issue related to quantifying the benefit of the regulations, the policies that we're developing. So we're doing what we can.
I'd like to choose someone. Let me go.
We've got microphones on both sides.
Yeah,
if
let me
people
go
put up
first
their
to
hands.
the back of the room, then we'll go to Dr. Goldson. We'll go to the front of the room.
Okay. Hear what you meant by back of the room?
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
This is kind of a follow-on to the previous question. You know, I think that there's a model out there that's been in place for quite some time in the federally regulated and state-regulated wastewater treatment industry, that the EPA, under the Clean Water Act over the last 20 years, and actually going back farther than that, has gone out and worked with regulated wastewater treatment operators and had them voluntarily upgrade their systems to reduce and eliminate wastewater leaks and spills, overflows, that kind of thing. In Texas, there was City of Austin, City of San Antonio, City of Dallas, City of Houston were all under orders to update their systems. Austin spent $300 million over about an 8-year period to do that. I think that model would be appropriate here is first a voluntary approach, fix your systems where they're known to be leaking. If you don't fix your systems, we will order you to fix them within a given time period. And I think the money is there. It's just somebody's got to tell them to do it.
I'm not sure. There was a question there, but I'll give.
And before
I'll turn it into an answer if you
Before
want.
we answer the question, I forgot to tell people to introduce themselves when they ask the question, but that was Chuck Lesniak from the city of Austin, Texas.
So I think that's look. From our point of view, there is a role for voluntary initiatives in solving this problem. Gas Star is a good example of that. I think as you go further up the value chain, right, it gets much more complicated, and frankly, we feel inadequate to solely rely on voluntary measures in order to be able to do this. I mean, again, I go back to the gathering and processing issue. Okay, there is such a poor understanding of where that infrastructure is, what its age is, what its condition is, that it's very difficult to contemplate that a voluntary program would get you there. When you get into production, it's even more complicated. There are literally thousands of producers out there. The barriers to entry are very low. It is not a defined universe of people that you can sort of get in a room and talk sense to. And so as a practical matter, what we see as a practical matter is in just about every step of the value chain, we see certain companies taking leadership positions, which is terrific. But the only way that we will know that everyone is doing the basics is if there's some kind of regulatory framework that requires everybody to be doing, the basic work. That's what we're missing right now. Okay. That 90% of the emission reduction opportunity from existing sources. That's what we're missing right now.
I'd like to move on from this and try and get a couple more questions in. So we go to
Rob Goldson from the Princeton Ridge Coalition. You said, Alan, at one point you had no permit or siting authority for new construction, and I'd like to challenge you a little bit on that, in that the environmental assessment process does require you to be the coordinating agency on safety, and that could be a tool one could use very strongly, but I don't see it being used. I'd also like to make one other small thing. Crowdsourcing is the modern way to do things. Why aren't we thinking about small, inexpensive leak detectors that everybody can connect to their smartphones and tell you what's going on?
Okay, related to the first comment or question, yes. I mean, we acknowledge that we participate in, the process with FERC, if you will. So we do comment on the docket regarding siting relevant to pipeline safety. The ultimate decision really is what I'm getting at is FERC's to make or State Department if you're talking Keystone XL, on the siting of the pipeline. Relevant to leak detectors, technology is pretty good, and there are all sorts of technology out there to find leaks. When you're talking safety and protecting people, all leaks aren't created equal, and a small leak over here may be hazardous or more hazardous than a large leak over here. So It would tell you certainly you have methane, but it wouldn't tell you the hazard relevant to that. Is the only concern there.
Christina?
And I was just going to jump on the leak portion of the question. If you look at leaks, as Alan said, they're not all created equal. You have the hazardous leaks, which tend to be the ones that are emitting a good bit of gas. And those are the ones that are required to be repaired immediately, to be fixed immediately. If you look beyond those large leaks, what you end up are ones that you have to repair over a period of time or to monitor. And when you think of monitoring, a number of those leaks are, you could have them one day and the next day they may be gone because the environment conditions have changed and they're so small. They smell it one day, it's such a small leak. You go back to investigate and you don't find it because it's gotten a little bit warmer and that gasket, that seal has expanded enough to seal the leak. So when you're looking at how to reduce methane emissions, you look at where are the big emitters. And for pipelines, the big emitters are things like excavation damage, the hazardous leaks, the blowdowns, the pneumatic devices. So you can start to pick it apart. And of course, the replacement of the infrastructure, which we think is pretty critical. When you look at the amount of natural gas that could potentially be emitted from cast iron and bare steel, it's far greater than others, which is why you see this constant push to replace those lines as quickly as possible. Even the ones that may still be fit for service. Alan had, or somebody had mentioned cast iron, right conditions, that stuff's great. Think of I don't know how many of you have cast iron skillets. I have a cast iron skillet that is probably about 150 years old. Perfect, absolutely perfect, because I season it a good bit and do a lot of other stuff with it. So it just depends on the environment.
I think in the front row here, here we got a microphone for you, and if you'll introduce yourself.
I'm Bob Beaumier. I'm the chair of the Washington State Citizen Pipeline Advisory Committee. And my question, I have spent 30 years as an attorney for the city of Spokane and local government, so I'm very familiar with problems associated with local infrastructure and how many times municipal paving operations, that is my former client, causes breaks in distribution systems. In fact, 2 years ago, my wife and I literally ran out of our house when the local repaving company, a private contractor, busted their line, and it was pretty exciting. And then a few weeks later, I was at a meeting in our church and got a knock on the door. The fire department evacuated our building, another leak. And that's just anecdotal experience of me. Why would, now that I'm on this committee, why would I have these experiences? I don't know if anybody else has had these. But my question really, as a local government person, formerly local government, my question has to do with some things that I was exposed to last night at the Beignet feast. I sat with two gentlemen, and it was frankly quite disturbing to learn of the variety of attention given to safety issues in various states. One gentleman, an activist, described, frankly, in my mind, horror stories of things that happened where he was active. And I wanted to ask the panel, it seems like we have two issues here. One is source of the problem, which I understand there's a diagnostic issue there, trying to identify in our nation where are the big sources of potential and actual problems. But the second issue is local culture of safety. We have, in my limited exposure from, for example, last night's conversation, a huge differential in how states and local governments approach this. And so, it seems like there's some barn doors that are quite a bit wider open than others. And what is the strategy for triaging these high profile, or maybe not locally high profile, but on a triage scale of need? What is the strategy for addressing those?
Anyone who wants to field this?
Well, so again, I think that we can, our experience is that the utilities that we've been working with are generally attentive, right, to the issues of safety. And I think that you can't argue the point that issues like with local contractors and the effectiveness of call before you dig and all of that is an incredibly important piece of this. I think what we're suggesting is that in addition, right, we are getting to the point where we have new diagnostic tools, right, better methane sensing technology, and we have the ability to use that information in new ways to do a much more effective job at not only finding leaks but sizing them. It is not necessarily true, right, that the size of the leak determines its hazard. And in fact, utilities don't regularly size their leaks currently. Their hazard protocols have much more to do with the proximity of the leak to populated areas, to buildings, to concentrations of gas that build up in enclosed structures. That could be the result of a small leak or a big leak. It has much more to do with the envelope of the building and its capturing of the gas than it does the flow rate of the leak.
Mark, I want to cut you off just to see. I know Dan flashed in. We have very little time. I just want to see if he had something to add, and Christina, and maybe we can get one more question in. So I apologize, but okay, Christina, real quick.
I wanted to touch on the municipality portion, and this is some of the work that PHMS is working on right now. There are certain municipalities that are exempt from calling before they dig. And unfortunately, we see a lot of issues where there are exemptions. PHMS is working on a regulation now to remove some of those exemptions to allow them to come in and take control in states where enforcement isn't as it should be or exemptions are allowed. From my perspective, I hate exemptions because that's all potential to run into one of our lines. Don't like that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I see Jeff Weiss, and I got to ask in advance, is this a question because you have a representative up here? Okay.
All good pieces of rhetoric can be turned into a question.
I want a question.
Okay, there will be one in here. And it's not often I get the opportunity to shuck a little bit of the blame, so allow me to do that, by the way. And I want to thank the panel. I think particularly for bringing out a couple of issues. One, it's a very complex issue. It's not as simple as it seems when you first start looking at it. But Mark brought out something I'd welcome comments from people on, and that is, as we diagnose the problem, as this gentleman just pointed out, how do we end up paying for it? You know, I think this is a really important question. And I think the public has to understand there are multiple forces at work that go towards infrastructure modernization. Some of it, which you ask the regulators, the state folks, and myself to do, is to push, but the rate setters can pull. You know, and it's a combination of those things, and I think Chairman Roberti touched on this as well. They're pushed to have fair and reasonable rates. The one group who, again, the comment that I'd entertain from people is how do we engage the consumer advocates who want to have the absolute cheapest rate possible and not allow some of this modernization? That was sort of a question.
Sort of a question. Anyone tackle this? I know we somewhat covered this at Secretary Moniz's roundtable.
Yeah, so let me take a quick cut at it. I think that we, as Rick just said, as Paul mentioned, this is one of the things that came out of the series of roundtables. I think we want to work through the Department of Energy. We're going to be working with NARUC to try to figure out how to encourage kind of best practices in this area, in the rate setting area. I think one thing to keep in mind there, and something that probably needs to be brought into the conversation is, of course, that greenhouse gas emissions have costs. We are seeing costs, and Alan touched on this. These aren't free. We're already seeing impacts from this, so we need to think about how to integrate that into our thinking. And I just want to briefly recap a couple of things. We've touched on a lot of things today, and I just want to sort of go back through a few things the administration is working on, just categories of things. Science and data is really important. EDF has played a major and leading role in this area. Mark talked about the 16 studies that they're working on across different parts of the value chain, different regions of the country, with universities, with a bunch of companies. That is hugely important to advancing our understanding of the problem in a granular way, and I think we want to work to build on that, and that's an important federal role. Technology development is another one. Department of Energy in particular is going to be working there. Better leak detection technology, things that have better controls. They're going to be setting standards for compressors. Standards, which we've talked about, we're looking, as I said, there are mixed authorities there. We're looking at, I think, trying to figure out what the best role for the federal government is and which parts, along with all the other actors we have here. And finally, convening and technical assistance, and that's where this roundtable and the discussion with NARUC comes in. So that's kind of broadly the things that we're working on.
Okay, I think we're done. I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to just quickly weigh in as someone who, from a Capitol Hill perspective, who worked on 4 of the last reauthorizations, to say I believe PHMSA does have authority to address leaks of any and all sorts. It has a mandate to do that and to deal with the infrastructure causing those leaks. This is a perspective of someone who's worked for an authorizing committee, and I think that's there and it can be used, and I do empathize with the cost question quite a bit with the industry. So thank you all for staying through and for your questions. Appreciate the time. I think we're doing a break.